discussion. This will be a short topic, the peripheral nervous system. This will be the second to the last topic also for FAPN. And then next week, we might not meet anymore because I have to give you the last topic earlier than usual. Kasi ang exam ninyo is June 9 to 13, if I'm not mistaken. So, if you will wait for June 6 before I give you the last topic, parang medyo too late na, no, for your exam. So, I should be able to give that to you earlier. So, we might not meet on June 6 anymore, and we'll just have an asynchronous session para you'll have that extra time to study. Would that be okay with all of you?
Yes po, Doc.
Sige. So, ganun na lang gawin natin, no? Para maaral nyo na in advance yung last topic. Medyo pa naman siya. Challenging din. Kasi it's about the autonomic nervous system. Anyway, the topic this morning is about peripheral nervous system. And a lot of the things that will be discussed in this topic has already been somehow touched upon in the different discussions that we had. So parang review of some sort, and also parang digging deeper into the peripheral nervous system. So when we say peripheral nervous system, what again is your understanding of this? Actually, nabigay ko yung definition nito in the beginning of the semester. Anybody? Or any idea? Doesn't have to be 100% correct naman. Ano lang yung naalala ninyo? No takers? Sige. So, when we say peripheral nervous system, if you still remember, ayan, sabi ni Ms. Fernandez, structures outside of the brain and spinal cord. Correct. Tama yun, no? When we say PNS, it contains the nerves that originate in the brain and spinal cord, but they end outside of the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so if you still remember, I told you, once it goes out of the brain and spinal cord, it's already a part of the peripheral nervous system. So it contains motor, sensory, and even autonomic neurons that innervate the end organs, and also includes yung mga sensory receptors, effector muscles, and glands. So actually, itong peripheral nervous system natin, if you will be more specific, it's composed of your 12 cranial nerves, 31 spinal nerves, and the other peripheral nerves. When we say peripheral nerves, yung mga branches of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So the branches that come out of those plexus and the branches that come out of those main nerves, lahat yan part na sila ng peripheral nervous system. So remember, we've already talked about the cranial nerves and also the spinal nerves. So somehow, napag-usapan na natin itong peripheral nervous system. Now, just to have a differentiation between the CNS and the PNS. In the CNS, when you have a bundle of axon, you call it tract. Remember, in your spinal cord, especially in the white matter, we discussed different tracts, di ba? Pinag-usapan natin yung corticospinal tract, spinothalamic tract, spinocerebellar tract, right? So that is what we call the bundle of axons in the CNS. But once it goes out of the central nervous system, it becomes called a nerve. Okay? So a bundle of axon is called a nerve in the peripheral nervous system. On the other hand, when you have a group of cell bodies or soma and their respective dendrites and synapses, in the CNS, we call that a nuclei. And I think it was also last week where I gave you the different nuclei, diba, in the central nervous system. We have the caudate nucleus, we have the basal ganglia, we also have the thalamus, the red nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, even the 4 nuclei of the cerebellum. So that is what we call a group of cell bodies or soma. But in the peripheral nervous system, we call that a ganglia. And remember, pinag-usapan natin yung isang specific ganglia sa may dorsal root, di ba? The dorsal root ganglia. That this is the enlargement after the dorsal root exits the posterior horn, di ba? Pag exit niya, bigla magkakaroon ng enlargement. So that is a group of cell bodies or soma. Yan. So the peripheral nervous system, again, as mentioned, contains both motor, sensory, and autonomic functions. So, yung sensory nerves ng ating peripheral nervous system, nag-exit yan sa posterior root. Okay, this is the posterior horn. Ang horn, ginagamit natin to describe the gray matter, no? Ito yung posterior horn, ito yung anterior horn. So, ang sensory kasi, diba, from the body towards the spinal cord. So, the flow is spinal nerve, dorsal root ganglia, tapos, papasok siya ng posterior horn. Okay? So, ang sensory natin, nanggagaling siya sa posterior. Ang mga motor nerve naman natin, di ba pag motor, from spinal cord to the effector muscle. So, they originate from the anterior horn naman. This is your anterior horn. So, anterior horn, punta ng anterior root bago pumunta ng spinal nerve. And then your autonomic neurons, if you still remember, there is a branch of the anterior root. Diba? May branch yung anterior root natin that becomes your sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Okay? Now, we already discussed this when we first opened our FAPN discussion. These are the different nerve fibers classified according to their size and the speed of conduction. And what is that substance that speeds up the conduction in nerves? What do we call that? Anybody? Yes, the myelin sheath. Okay? So remember that, no? Your myelin sheath, which is produced by your Schwann cells. Pag nasa PNS, Schwann cells. Pag nasa CNS, oligodendrocytes. So, this myelin sheath produced by your Schwann cells coats these nerve fibers and insulates it. Diba? This insulation then causes the jumping of action potential. And that jumping is called saltatory conduction. So if you still remember, we have A fibers, B fibers, and C fibers. The A fibers are myelinated, thus they are the fastest. Sorry for that. They are the fastest conducting nerves. And then we also have the B fibers, yung parang midline, and then the C fibers, the unmyelinated ones. And their conduction velocity is very slow. Now, your A fibers is further classified as alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And each one of them would have a different function. So, you also have to memorize this again, ha? Your alpha A fibers are for motor functions. Your beta A fibers, sensory. Your gamma A fibers, reflexes, muscle spindle. And then your delta A fibers for pain. Again, all of them are myelinated. Your B fibers naman, autonomic, specifically preganglionic. And your C fibers, the unmyelinated ones, sila yung slowest, pero anong kinikerry nila? Pain. So we have two pain carriers, ha? Your unmyelinated C fibers and your delta fibers. Those two are your pain receptors. or pain, they carry pain. Yeah. So, how does our nerve work again? Diba? Remember, your nerve cell membranes are sensitive to electrochemical changes. Diba? So, normally, the, the charge inside the nerve is negative, while the charge outside is positive. Paano natin nare-remember yan? Sinabi ko sa inyo dati, piso. Potassium is inside, sodium is outside. And sodium is more positive compared to your potassium. Diba? So, ang normal state, piso. Potassium is inside, sodium is outside. And since sodium is more positive than potassium, this creates a potential difference. Diba? This potential difference is due to the imbalance of ion on one side of the cell membrane. So, we call that potential difference, we call that resting membrane potential. Okay? Remember that? Your resting membrane potential. So, resting membrane potential is when no action potential is occurring. But when an irritability happens or a stimulus happens, it will start to react. So how will it start to react? There will be a depolarization or a changing in the resting potential. So the normal is negatively charged. So what will happen? Your sodium will enter the nerve. Okay? So remember that sodium is more positive. Therefore, the charge inside the nerve will start to become positive. And when that happens, an action potential will grow. So an action potential is the propagation of depolarization across the membrane. Okay? So parang nire-review na lang natin yung nerve physiology natin nung umpisa. After an action potential is birthed, then it will produce a repolarization na. Repolarization is the immediate return of the membrane from a positive charge back to the normal, which is negatively charged. And this is accomplished by your potassium efflux. Okay? So, any questions so far? Or quite easy kasi parang nagre-review lang tayo? Okay. So, how fast does the signal go to the effector muscles? Or paano ba nakakarating? Diba? Let's say nakagawa na tayo ng action potential. At yung action potential, dumadaloy na no? From our brain to the spinal cord to, let's say, the spinal nerves. So how does it go to the effector muscle? It communicates with the muscle through the neuromuscular junction. So I think this has already also been discussed in your FAPN, diba? So the neuromuscular junction or NMJ forms an electrical to chemical back to electrical link between the nerve and the muscle synapse. So when we say synapse, that is the connection, no, between nerve to nerve or even nerve to muscle. Alrighty? So, di ba ang ating signal impulses are electrical impulses? So, from brain to the spinal nerve, it will be electrical. And then, from the spinal nerve to the muscle, it will be chemical again. It will be chemical. And muscle to muscle, it will be, again, electrical. So, the NMJ allows the impulses to be transferred from the CNS to the PNS and the muscles to cause effect. At ano yung chemical that accomplishes that? It's a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So here is a good diagram showing us how action potential is carried from the nerve to the muscle. So, ang gagawin natin, we'll study it by number. Itong mga numbers na nakalabel dito. Okay? So, first that happens, itong yellow na to is your myelin sheath. Tapos, your root nodes of Ranvier. And then, this is your axon terminal, yung dulong-dulo ng axon. And this is your presynaptic junction. presynaptic junction. Kasi itong gitnang to, this is your synaptic cleft. Okay? So, presynaptic junction, synaptic cleft, this is your motor plate or postsynaptic junction. Okay? So, na-orient na tayong lahat. So, first, an action potential will be brought from the soma down to the axon terminal. Bababa yung action potential natin by saltatory conduction. Once it reaches the neuromuscular junction, the presynaptic junction will be depolarized. So, pag na-depolarize to, anong kailangan mangyari? Kailangan maging positive siya. So, anong papasok sa kanya? Calcium. So, your voltage-gated calcium channels will have to open to allow the entry of calcium. So, once calcium enters the presynaptic junction, the membrane will become more positive. Okay? If it becomes more positive, then these vesicles containing your acetylcholine, no, kasi yung acetylcholine, they are stored in vesicles. Yan sila. Once the presynaptic junction is depolarized, then these vesicles will release the acetylcholine. Paano nila i-release? Didikit yung vesicle doon sa end part ng presynaptic junction, and then by exocytosis, release their acetylcholine. Okay. Now, when your acetylcholine has been freed from the vesicles, it will diffuse, no? Kakalat sila all over the synaptic cleft. And they will interact with the receptors found on the postsynaptic end or on the motor end plate. So that's number 5. They will attach to those motor end plate receptors. Once they attach, it will allow the entry of sodium. Okay, it will allow the entry of sodium inside that motor end plate, causing depolarization again. Okay, kakaroon ulit ng depolarization. And thus, the action potential will be created and it will be passed on to the muscle fiber. Paano titigil yung action potential? So, you see this blue, parang buttons here? This is actually an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. So what does your acetylcholinesterase do? They rapidly inactivate your acetylcholine para hindi na sila mag-attach doon sa motor end plate. So once your acetylcholine has been neutralized by acetylcholinesterase, the stimulation will end. Tapos babalik na siya sa repolarization. Okay? So, in order to summarize everything, I actually included a summary table. Yan. So, action potential will go down the axon terminal and reach the neuromuscular junction. Second, when the presynaptic junction is depolarized, it will open the voltage-gated calcium channel. Pag nag-open yan, definitely papasok ang calcium. Pag pumasok ang calcium, madedepolarize na lalo, no? Yung presynaptic junction natin. Thus, the acetylcholine, which is stored in small vesicles, will be released. Once they are freed, they will diffuse rapidly, no? And they will go to the motor end plate. And they will interact with the receptor sites. This interaction will increase the permeability of the muscle cell to ions such as sodium. Okay? So when sodium enters the muscle cell, it will depolarize the muscle fiber and will trigger an action potential. Okay? After which, acetylcholine will be rapidly inactivated by acetylcholinesterase. Yan. So that's the entirety of the neuromuscular junction. Any questions here? clear naman. So, pag naipasa na sa muscles, yung action potential, then, yung muscles natin will be able now to perform the different movements or motions that it can do. Flexion, extension, no? Magagawa na niya. So, let's also review the nerve structure. Remember, your nerve has different coverings, di ba? So, umpisahan muna natin sa labas. Your entire nerve is actually covered by an epineurium. Tapos, if you remember, si epineurium, it will fold papunta sa loob. No? Pupunta siya sa loob and it will become your perineurium. Perineurium covers the bundles of neurons, di ba? Or we call them fascicles. So this is one fascicle, another, here's another one, and here's another one. Yan sila, oh. Kino-cover nila each fascicle. And then, this perineurium will fold again inside and will cover each individual neuron. And we call that endoneurium. Diba? Still remember that? Here's another image. Epineurium covering the entire nerve. Perineurium covering your fascicle. And then your endoneurium covering each individual nerve. So now let's go to the nerve plexuses. From our discussion last week, ano ba yung mga nerve plexus? What do we mean by this? Nerve plexus. No takers, sige. So these are web-like interconnections of fibers from many nerves. Diba sabi ko sa inyo, these are communications, conglomerations. Pag nag-join together yung iba't ibang mga spinal nerves natin. So usually common yan sa spinal nerve, no? That as the spinal nerves exit the intervertebral foramina, they will connect with each other and they will form new branches and a plexus. So from this plexus, new nerves will emerge and we call them peripheral nerves now. So there are different nerve plexuses, cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. So I will just introduce you to them, but during the laboratory, Sir Kim will be the one to discuss them fully. Okay? So let's start with the cervical plexus. Ang cervical plexus is a combination of C1 to C5. Okay? So, kita nyo dito, no? Ito yung C1 mo, but a portion of C1 also connects with C2. Then your C2, a portion of it will be connected to C3, a portion of it will be connected to C1 and to C3. So that's how interconnected they are. Pwedeng dalawa lang, pwedeng tatlo, pwedeng apat, nagko-connect-connect. At nagkikreate sila ng mga bagong branches. Like, ito, lesser occipital nerve, greater auricular nerve, no? Ansa cervicalis, your phrenic nerve. So, marami silang kinikreate na branches. So, your cervical plexus, again, C1 to C5, ano ba sinusupply niya? Sensory and motor ng head, neck, and upper shoulders. So, one of the most important branches na nagawa ng cervical plexus is your phrenic nerve. Okay? Phrenic nerve is a combination of C3 to C5. So, ito po siya. C3, C4, C5. It's your phrenic nerve. And what does the phrenic nerve do? It innervates the diaphragm. Remember from your FAPC? Ba? So, here is your roots, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and then all the nerves that come out of your cervical plexus. Phrenic, supraclavicular, communication with vagus nerve, greater auricular, lesser occipital, hypoglossal, lahat yan. Okay, so again, Sir Kim will be the one to discuss that with you. Next, we have the brachial plexus. Parang out of the four, ito yung pinaka sikat, no? The brachial plexus. So ito naman, it's a combination of the roots of C5 to T1. And what it does is to supply the sensory and motor neurons to the whole arm. Upper arm, forearm, and even the hands. Okay? So, here are the roots, C5, C6, C7, C8, T1. And then, etong brachial plexus natin, medyo complicated siya, no? Kaya nga siya yung pinakasikat eh. Kasi siya meron siyang roots, tapos by this time, meron siyang trunk, meron siyang division, and then meron siyang cords. So later on, makikita natin yan. Here you go. The roots, the trunks, the divisions, and then the cords. So when we say roots, yun yung C5, C6, C7, C8, T1. When we say trunks, you have a superior trunk, a middle trunk, and an inferior trunk. Pag division, meron kang superior anterior, superior posterior, middle anterior, middle posterior, inferior anterior, inferior posterior divisions. And then yung cords mo, meron kang lateral, medial, posterior. And then your end, no? So ito lahat ng mga nerves na lumalabas sa brachial plexus. Long thoracic, dorsal scapular, suprascapular, lateral and medial pectoral, musculocutaneous, median, ulnar, radial. So, tingnan natin yung kanilang mga distribution. So, meron tayong axillary nerve from your brachial plexus. Ito yung sinusupplyan niya. Basically, the deltoid muscle, no? Yan siya. Meron din tayong musculocutaneous nerve. Isa yon sa end, di ba? Yan siya. So, ang sinusupplyan naman niya, lateral forearm. Lateral forearm. We also have the radial nerve. Ang radial nerve, isa rin yan sa dulo. Radial nerve. So, sinusupplyan naman niya the dorsal part of the arm, the forearm, and the hand. So, dorsal meaning yung likod na parte. Tapos, pag radial, always remember thumb. Yan. Ito naman, ulnar. Ang ulnar, isa rin yan sa dulo. Yan, no? Ulnar naman, sinusupplyan niya the medial aspect of the hand. Yan siya. And then, your median nerve, sinusupplyan naman niya yung anterior 2/3 of the arm. Yan. Okay? So, again, more of that during the laboratory. Next, we have the femoral plexus. This is composed of T12 to L5. So, this supplies the sensory and motor neurons to the entirety of the legs. Okay, so hip, legs, yan. One of the biggest contributions of the femoral plexus or the lumbar plexus is your femoral nerve. So, siya yung naka-green. L2, L3, L4. Femoral nerve, which innervates your hip flexors or your quadriceps muscles. Okay? That's the job of your femoral nerve. Another important branch is your obturator nerve from L2 to L4 also. So, ito siya. L2, L3, L4. That's your obturator nerve, which provides innervation to the thigh. Okay? So, here are your roots, T12 to L5, and then the different branches that come out. So, usually, puro legs yan, no? So, ito ang sinusupplyan ng obturator nerve natin. Basically, thigh and the medial leg. Lastly, we have the sacral plexus, which is from L4 to S4. Okay, and the biggest branch that comes out is your sciatic nerve. In fact, the sciatic nerve is the largest nerve of the body. It's a branch of L4 to S3, and it innervates the entire foot and lateral leg. So, buong paa, saka yung labas na part ng ating leg. So, here are your roots, and here are the branches that they create. So as I mentioned, the entire foot and the lateral branch. Here's another image, lateral branch of your leg. So any questions about the plexuses? Again, more of that during the laboratory. Okay. Now let's go to dermatomes. So dinescribe na natin yung dermatomes last time, di ba? They are segments of the skin supplied by a single spinal nerve. So sinabi natin last week, di ba, that each part is supplied by a spinal nerve except for anong spinal nerve yung walang ambag? C1. Okay, C1 lang yung wala. So the dermatome map, which I will show you in the next slide, shows you the skin of the body with the associated spinal nerve. Yan. So, di ba, this is the anterior view, posterior view. So, mga usually tinatanong lang naman dyan, nipple, so T4, umbilicus, T10, genitalia, di ba? Tinatanong din yan. Tapos yung anus. Yun yung mga usual na tinatanong. Okay? Now, sabi natin sa dermatome, ito yung sensory part, no, sensory segment ng ating skin. Now, paano ba nare-receive ng mga sensory nerves natin yung stimulus sa skin natin? It is through different receptors. Okay? So actually in your FAPC, during the skin discussion, pinag-usapan na rin natin to. So somehow, parang review na lang ulit. So your mechanoreceptors, they respond to, of course, mechanical deformation. Thermoreceptors respond to temperature. So when there is a change in temperature, like heat or cold, they produce an action potential. Nociceptors naman, they respond to damage in the tissues. Electromagnetic receptors, these are found in the eyes. So, di ba? We have rods and cones in our eyes. Ang kanilang stimulus ay light. So once light enters the eyes, they will convert it into electrical impulse. Then lastly, your chemoreceptors. These are found in our taste buds. Kasi chemicals naman yung taste, di ba? It's also found in our nose for smell. And lastly, in our blood. So these are the different receptors. Now, to be more specific, we have different types of receptors, no? You have your pain and temperature receptors, which is carried by what nerve fiber again? Your A delta and your C, diba? Which is the unmyelinated one. Sila yung nagdadala. Now, ang mga pain and temperature receptors, they are free nerve endings, meaning hindi sila encapsulated. Malaya sila. Okay? They are free. Yan. They are found in the skin. Now, once they receive a signal, they will bring it to the spinothalamic tract. Remember, spinothalamic tract, pain and temperature. Diba? Pinatandaan ko yan. Spinothalamic tract, pain and temperature. Your spinothalamic tract is also known as your anterior lateral or anterolateral tract. And pain and temperature receptors are usually very slow adapting receptors. Now, we also have, aside from pain receptors, we also have cutaneous mechanoreceptors. So, So, ang nadedetect nila are mechanical deformations, no? So, the first example for cutaneous mechanoreceptors are your Merkel or tactile discs. Again, they are also non-encapsulated. And I also want you to remember where they are found, ha? Epidermis. Sa epidermal layer sila. Anong nadedetect nitong Merkel tactile disc natin? Light touch. Okay? And they are carried by your group 2 fibers. Okay? And then, after they receive light touch, they will bring the signal to the spinothalamic tract and the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. If you still remember yung dorsal column lemniscus pathway, it also pertains to the posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway. Iisa lang yun. Posterior funiculus or dorsal column, it pertains to the same thing. Okay? So, yan yung Merkel or tactile corpuscle natin. Found in the epidermis for light touch, brings it to the spinothalamic or dorsal column pathway. Yan sila. Next is your Meissner corpuscles. No? So they are also tactile corpuscles, but the difference is they are now encapsulated. They are encapsulated, and another difference from your Merkel, they are found in the dermis. So what's their job naman? They mediate fine discriminative tactile sensation. So kung yung kanina crude, di ba? Crude touch, si Merkel, si Meissner, fine touch naman siya. And where does it bring its signal? Directly to the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Okay? Next, we have your Pacinian corpuscles. This is found in different body parts such as in the dermis, even in the mesentery and periosteum, in the bone. So ano naman ang nare-receive ng Pacinian corpuscles natin? Pressure and vibration. Pressure and vibration. So it brings the signal to the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Okay? And next group, we have your muscle and tendon mechanoreceptors. When you say muscle and tendon, they are usually encapsulated. So the first one are muscle receptors, and we have two specific types, no? Intrafusal and extrafusal. So when we say muscle receptors, they consist of capsules kasi nga encapsulated sila, and they have intrafusal fibers parallel to your extrafusal fibers. So, ang dinedetect nila or minimediate nila, muscle stretch reflex and myotactic reflexes. So, sensitive sila doon sa change in length or the stretch at yung gaano kabilis nag-change yung length ng muscle, the dynamic function. Okay? So, when we mentioned kanina, no, pag muscle receptors, gamma motor neurons, di ba? Yung reflexes, gamma motor. Also, in these fibers, no, intrafusal or extrafusal, there are different structures. We have nuclear bag fibers and nuclear chain fibers. So, nuclear bag, ito yan yung nakapalibot doon sa parang enlarged portion ng fiber na to. And we also have nuclear chain fibers, yung magkakadugtong na yan. So, nuclear bag fibers, they receive group 1A afferent fibers. So, they are responsible for the rate of change ng muscle length. So, bag fibers, gaano kabilis nagbabago yung muscle length. Nuclear chain fibers, almost the same. No, group 1A din siya, pero ang dinidetect naman niya, muscle length. Okay, so yan yung two specific structures found in your muscle receptors at kung anong ginagawa nila. Okay? Now, here is an image showing us that connection between this encapsulated muscle fiber. We call that intrafusal muscle fiber, no? And then, we also have the connection of the nerves to the muscle called neuromuscular junctions. So, ito yung bag fibers, no? Pag umiikot na sila around that area. So, it detects the change, the rate of muscle change, and then the chains are responsible naman for the muscle length itself. Lastly, we also have the gamma motor neurons. So, the gamma motor neurons, we already mentioned this. It's responsible for the reflexes, the static and dynamic motor neurons. No? So, static and dynamic, yung sinasabi natin kaninang rate of change ng length and the length itself. And then, Golgi tendon organs, we also discussed this last week. It's found at the junction of the muscle and tendon. At anong ginagawa nila? Si Golgi tendon, nire-relax niya yung muscle, di ba? to prevent damage or to prevent overtension. You know, it's very sensitive to tension development. Alright? So you have your Golgi tendon organ here at the junction. Then you also have your muscle spindles, which we already talked about. So this is already the last slide showing you the different non-encapsulated receptors, which are usually the sensory, and then the encapsulated, which are usually the motor, no? So you should be able to memorize kung para saan sila. Una, encapsulated or non-encapsulated. Where can they be found? Epidermis, dermis, di ba? And then, ano yung function nila? Bawat isa. Okay? So, that's the end of the discussion. Very quick lang siya. Any questions?